All right. Hello. To everybody watching, my name is Lauren Smith. I am the dramaturg for Musings of Fire. So great to have you watching this interview. I'm here with Professor Santiago Sosa, who is the deviser and director for Musings of Fire. All right. So
Hello.
let's jump right in, shall we? Okay. So this is a very original and new production to happen at KU. I think it's a very unique thing that a lot of people haven't seen before. And I want to know what sparked your interest into making something like this.
Yeah, so last summer we are all in quarantine and things were crazy and everything was kind of strange. And my friend Mason, who I've worked with about 3 or 4 years ago on a production of Romeo and Juliet, he's getting his MFA at the Old Globe in San Diego. And so he calls me up and says, "Hey man, can you like record a monologue or something? Because I'm doing this thing called remote artist since we can't really be doing theater right now." I was like, "Oh, sure." And so I just recorded a monologue and he had this Instagram page. And so at first, a bunch of people were just because I think at that time it started back in March or April. We were like, "Oh, this won't go for that long. Let's just do something for a month." And then it kept going and going. And then as the months went on, the monologue started to get more and more recontextualized for what was going on today. And there's a lot of different monologues of sometimes they would have clips of things that were going on in the news, or they would sort of make their own thing that would make it relevant to today. And I just remember thinking to myself, oh man, I just can't take any more news. Like everywhere you are scrolling, Instagram, Facebook, the news, there's just so much bad news and horrible news. And it was just sort of overwhelming.
Mhm.
And so I just started reading a bunch of different Shakespeare and seeing like how it was relevant. And then Olena Hodges from the Island Shakespeare Festival called me up and says, "Hey, do you have some sort of an idea for a production for this playground series that we're doing that's about just anything that's going on, current events? Like we're trying to do stuff that's theater for culture and social awareness, or just anything." And I just had all these ideas. I've been reading Harold Bloom, which wrote this book, which is called The Invention of the Human, which is, he talks a lot about how Shakespeare talks about the invention of the human. And I was reading all these essays, just a lot of really nerdy things because I was tired of binge watching shows. And yeah, then I started, as I was digging into a lot of plays, finding a lot of similarities to things that were going on currently and things that have been going on in the past,
Mhm.
and finding just how relevant those words were. And it was nice to sort of assemble it and shed some light to the things that were currently going on with different words, with poetic words.
Yeah, totally. I think that's yes, because I've been studying a lot of like social justice art and theater recently, and I think especially now, like you said, when in the middle of a pandemic, you're bombarded with so much bad news and
Mhm.
everything just feels like nothing is going right. It feels like social justice art, especially theater, can be so inspiring because sometimes when you're only hearing the bad things and you're not hearing that call to action at the end, it's just like, oh, there's a pandemic, like brace yourself, or oh, there's a revolution going on, brace yourself. It doesn't feel like there's end of the
Mhm.
tunnel. But when you create something like this, it feels like you can be much more connected and you feel like there is end in sight.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great way of putting it.
So I also want to know about what started your interest in Shakespeare in the first place.
So I grew up in South America, and my parents were Southern Baptist missionaries. And way back when, I guess eighth grade or something like that, um, we were going to read Romeo and Juliet, which is what everyone does in eighth or ninth grade. And I just kind of asked my dad if he knew anything about Shakespeare because I sure didn't. And I was living in South America, so like, why am I studying this sort of thing? And his response at the dinner table really was he just started going into a Shakespeare model. He's like, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." He's kind of dramatic sometimes. And I was like, what? And he goes through the whole monologue, like word for word. And I was just kind of like, wait, what was that? And he said, oh, I studied it when I was in seminary. And so he studied lots of speeches by John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Cesar Chavez, and Shakespeare. And he said, what we learned, we studied those kind of speeches because Shakespeare's words were about the power of words and what they can do to move, persuade, inspire people. And it's all about rhetoric and argument. And it kind of went down a rabbit hole of learning all these things about how he invented something like 3,000 words. If there wasn't a word for something, he just made it up. And some things that are just really simple, like eyeball. There was eyes, and he's like, that's an eyeball. And you're like, oh, okay, we have that word because of Shakespeare. Or luggage.
He invented luggage?
Yeah, it was either luggage or baggage. I can't remember. Probably baggage. Or maybe both. There's all kinds of like basic words.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where it started.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was in college, I was actually an art major. I wanted to be a graphic designer, or actually, I really wanted to be either a comic book artist, or I wanted to be a storyboard artist for movies. So I was doing a lot of drawing. And then when I was in college, I auditioned for a play because I was bored. I had lots of energy, and the theater kids seemed like they were having way more fun than the art kids.
Yep.
So I was in You Can't Take It With You. And I just kind of flipped it over to doing design, costumes, sets, and then eventually acting and directing. And for me, truly, the thought of Shakespeare was, these characters are just as big and as large and as magical as comic book characters. They were dramatic, and their stories are extreme. And that's kind of where it started. And once I started, I just kind of didn't stop.
Yeah, that tends to happen with something like Shakespeare, where there's so much, you're like, well, now this is my life, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something really interesting where people sometimes get kind of intimidated by Shakespeare because they don't know really what it is, or they're like, that feels like too much. I don't really want to get into it. I was like that, I know, especially when I was in middle school, when you first read like an excerpt from Romeo and Juliet, or even a sonnet, and you're like, I don't even know what that says. So do you have any like advice or anything to people who want to get into Shakespeare but like don't really know what's going on with it, or maybe don't really like Shakespeare but they don't know why? Anything?
Yeah. One of the biggest notes I give to a lot of students and actors is, I'll say, take the Shakespeare out,
Mm-hmm.
which is, there's this preconceived notion that it has to be performed a certain way, and it's sort of alienating, and it's meant for the higher ups and the super intellectuals and the unreachable people, but it really isn't. And so Shakespeare wrote for the common people. He was a common man. He's the son of a glove maker from Stratford upon Avon. He didn't go to college. He taught himself. He read his own books and figured his own things out. And he wrote for the common people. And eventually the queens and the royals and all of the lords and dukes and duchesses started to be like, oh, this is pretty good. This is actually almost as good as Marlowe, who was actually very, very educated.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I'll say is that it is meant for everyone, and that there's a character for everyone that they can identify with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once you find that one character that really resonates with you, their story, Shakespeare teaches us so much about forgiveness and empathy, and mothers and brothers and fathers and everybody just learning how to love one another. And that the stories are so universal that if you look more for what the stories are and what that poetry is illuminating, then you'll really start to see how it's still important, and why we have over 250 Shakespeare festivals in the United States alone.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I could kind of understand Shakespeare when I was like a freshman and sophomore in high school, but it wasn't until I got cast as the first witch in Macbeth that I actually got excited. I was like, oh my gosh, this is actually so fun. Like, I know what these words mean, and I can like embody them, and I know what's going on. And I think that's a really big thing with theater people. Like, that's how they like get involved with Shakespeare. And I totally agree with what you're saying about like identifying with a character. And I think that's a big wall that people put up with themselves with Shakespeare, is like, they generalize it with like, oh, it's so dramatic, and that's like all I know about it, and that's all I'm going to learn about it. So I totally
Mhm.
agree with that. Back to musing specifically, though, I want to know. So obviously, we're in the middle of a very large pandemic right now. Things are not the same as they would be if we were going to be doing this with maybe a bigger cast, or not with plastic masks on and not being 6 feet apart. And I want to know what the biggest challenge has been for you devising and directing a show that is during a pandemic.
Yeah. Well, one, it was trying to figure out how. So the artistic director, Alina, said, "Can we get these professional actors that have worked with us in the show?" And I was like, "Okay, how do I? Okay, I've never really directed anybody remotely. Like I've done some Zoom coachings, so it was like, how do we bring this in? We can't do a full show where we're interacting and there's touching or fighting or any kind of like intimacy. We can't come within 6 feet. Like, how do we keep people separate?" So I started looking for what was the themes, and the biggest one was for isolation.
Mhm.
And and then I was like, okay, this can't be your traditional style play. So I'm going to venture into a world that I didn't know much about, which was like devising experimental theater. Usually I'm like, I'll pick Henry IV, Part One. Good, go.
Mhm.
It's written, let's go. Um, and this time it was like, I have to research pieces that can resonate with people now. So,
Mhm.
one, the challenge is the pandemic, remote directing, getting a small cast to embody many, many characters and many, many themes,
Mhm.
and trying to figure out how to do it in a way that's engaging but not overbearing. And so I went with a shorter one. So this is only 32 to 35 minutes. And then I started feeling like I was missing something, and I started talking to Professor Darcy, who is wonderful about movement and devising. And she's got this great training, this great background with like building things and devising and adapted stuff. And so she really asked me a lot of questions and said, she was like, "I don't understand what this is. Like, how does this connect? How do you move this into that?" And so what I originally had was just kind of like a whole bunch of great ideas and a really nice cauldron and could call back to Macbeth. And she just really helped kind of sift through it and said, how do we put this together? Why does this connect? And I started to come up with this idea, and truly, when people are like, well, what is this play about? I was like, I wouldn't say it's a play, it's a Shakespeareans of it's a
Shakespeareans.
so it's
I'm
so it
putting
is
that
a
on the
it's a
website.
multi so
Shakespeare.
it's like spoken word, it's a movement piece, it is a multimedia piece, it's theater for culture and social awareness, it's
Mhm.
all kinds of things. And so when someone said, well, what's the beginning, middle, and end? And I said, life doesn't, it has a beginning, a middle, and end,
Mhm.
birth and death, really. But truly, if we're just in the middle of something, it all feels so random. It's
Mhm.
all these things that were happening over the summer and all of 2020, they're just happening with no rhyme or
Yeah.
reason. Like we're just like, what's happening? Okay, now this is happening. Okay, now this is happening. So I wanted to just sort of capture that feeling or the essence of the random craziness of what was going on last year
Yeah.
and was still kind of going on. And then the
Mhm.
other challenge was trying to do it in the middle of our own little snowpocalypse here in Lawrence.
Yeah, for real. For viewers who don't know, it has been like -5 degrees for the past couple days. No biggie though. It's all good. We're totally not dying out
Snow,
here.
rolling blackouts.
Psh, no problem. Like that would happen on top of everything else. Should we put that in the play too? At
Somehow.
effigy. uh, yes, I love that. And that's exactly how it feels. I never really thought of it that way, but that like makes sense for why it works. It feels like a life. It feels like these things are just happening because they're happening. There's not a rhyme or reason. There's not a character that caused everything to happen. It's not like a woo. So that was a really good way of putting it. I never really thought about it like that. Um,
Yeah. And our brains just swimming and swirling. And so you'll see
yeah.
lots of themes of like circular randomness speeds. Our brains have so many things going on inside of our heads
Yeah,
that we're
for
just
real.
like, I don't know how to get rid of all of this.
Yeah. And so you don't, you just put it on stage.
Right, exactly. There you go.
Okay, I have, I think, one more question, but we'll talk a little bit at the end. Is there anything in particular that you have taken away from this experience as a director that you might keep with you for the future?
Gosh, yes. It has really taught me the spirit of like how to truly collaborate.
Mhm.
Like this is a piece that when people are like, oh, you wrote it, I was like, I mean, really, we all did it. Like you helped Maricela, gave me some great ideas and looked over the script. Darcy still has ideas. Professor Darcy still's like, what do you think about this? Or what about that? And then like, yes. And then the actors are like, cool, we can do that. Yeah, we'll do that.
Mhm.
And then they'll say, can we cut this line? Can we add this line? Can we bring this back in? So it has been really a team thing. So when someone was like, oh, you're the director of this thing, I was like, I just kind of like got the ball rolling, and all
Mhm.
of us have
Totally.
really been working on it. And John Rohr has done a great job on design.
What a king.
Yeah, Lindsay, all the way out in Michigan, is doing these. Lindsay Webster's doing all these designs through projection, and we're communicating from Lawrence to Michigan, and I hadn't even seen the projections until tech, and then I saw them. I was like, "What?" I mean, it's just it's everybody. So
Mhm.
really, I just sort of like was the spark, but everybody that's been working on this has really been the fire, and so
Mhm.
that's something that I really learned and loved about working on the show.
Yeah, totally. That's awesome. Oh, my kitty's meowing. I don't know if you heard him. Um, okay, I forgot I wrote down a different question. So this is the last one. So again, with the pandemic, it is ever present, so I'm
Mhm.
going to keep talking about it. Um, I know that a lot of people in my life have found it hard to stay motivated to do what they love, no matter how much they love it. It is so hard to stay kept up with the things that you love during a pandemic when it feels like you
Mhm.
can't go anywhere, you don't know where to draw inspiration from. Is there anything in particular that keeps you motivated and keeps you on the ball to keep this production like going?
Yes, I think, and I think I was just talking about this with my friend Caroline the other day. Was whatever sort of creative spirit being creature I have inside of me is just really stubborn. Like it's just like it's gonna find something. It
Mm-hmm.
and so I've actually been working on four projects during this time,
Ooh.
because I that creative monster inside of me is just too stubborn to like not do anything. And it's the
Mm-hmm.
same thing that when my friend was asking me like, how are you doing that? And I said, it's the same way that I've stayed on the path of just doing theater, period.
Mm-hmm.
When someone says, how have you stayed in it this long? I was like, I just never had a backup plan. And
Yeah.
so I just didn't have a backup plan for not being creative. So one of these other projects I'm working on called This of Juliet is coming out this Friday,
Mm.
which is a web series in 10 parts that is about Juliet if she was a YouTube vlogger, and it takes
I
us through
love
the
that.
entire through the entire series. And then you might get a kick out of this. I'm getting back in touch with my old punk rock roots from when I was in college, but I'm writing a 10 to 12 song visual album based on from Hamlet's perspective, as
Oh,
if he was an emo kid in 2006.
tell me he's not
So
though. He totally
like no,
is.
he's either
Shakespeare just
that or a
predicted the
hipster.
future by accident.
So
That's
I'm
so
writing like a
true.
little emo album, and each song will have a music video that will kind of take us through
Ooh, that'll be really
the
cool.
story of Hamlet. So I'm just too stubborn. I think that's what it
Yeah.
is.
I mean, yeah, that's how a lot of artists are. It's just like, I don't know how to stop.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, I think that's all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for meeting with me. Round of
Yeah.
applause
Thank
for
you.
Mr. Sosa, everybody. I know you're not here,
Well,
but I know
applause for
you will be
you.
clapping at home. Okay.